All right, welcome back. We're ready for Section 8, Land Use Planning and Control. So again, we're building a foundation. In the very beginning, we talked about individual property owners' rights, and I've touched on several times that even the government has some ability to control what we can do with our properties. And now we're going to go a little bit deeper into that. Land use planning and control. Imagine what would happen if the government had no interference whatsoever, if there was not a governing body over what we can do with property. There were no building codes, there were no Environmental Protection Agency laws, there was no jurisdiction over what anybody could do on their privately owned property. It would be about like driving down the road with no speed limits and no red lights. It would just be mass chaos. So sometimes we think it's really restrictive, but there is a plan in place and we just have to trust our local government. And we're going to go a little bit deeper today into what some of those things that the government can have jurisdiction on and exactly how different public rules, because that's governmental thing, things done for the public, how public rules can affect private ownership of property. All right, you ready? So let's get going. First off, the goals of land use control. Whenever a governing entity takes a look at property, they're usually looking at what we call the highest and best use of property. There's a spot in our town in Evans, Georgia. Whenever I was growing up, this corner, Main Road, Washington Road. If you're a golf fan, Washington Road, about 10 miles down or 5 miles down, is actually where the Augusta National is, where the Masters tournament's played. So main road, main intersection, but whenever I was growing up in Evans, that corner was a school. Started out as a high school, then it was a middle school, and guess what that corner is now? It's a Home Depot and a CVS and a Verizon store. And this property, the school was torn down long ago. We saved some of what they wanted to save as history, but the school was torn down, and the highest and best use of that land at one time was a school and football fields and a public interest building. But now the highest and best use of that is a retail corner. So highest and best use for the property is one of the things that the government looks at. What is the best interest of the public as a whole? If we are that homeowner with a property that borders the main road, we may not like it whenever the government needs to take part of our property to make a turn lane or to widen the roads, but the government does still have that ability as long as they're working in the best interest of the public. So with land use planning, they take a look at the overview of the land, how the public is functioning in that land, and what do we need to do to make this property or make these properties function better. Part of land use control is that they could dictate that certain areas be used for commercial reasons, where we do business, and that other areas be completely delineated as residential areas where we're only going to live there. So sometimes they can interfere with zoning and have some rules on zoning, and then also the use of the land itself. They always start though with a master plan. Again, looking out over the area, making decisions as to what the breakdown and the layout of the county is going to be. And I'd be willing to bet if you go home and search for your county records in your state, you can probably find even some publicly available land use and master plan maps. If you've never known that was a thing, it's actually pretty interesting. In our county, Columbia County in Georgia, they have big maps on the walls, and they've already got drawn out future road widenings, where street lights are going, where different things are going to be rezoned. So it's actually neat to take a look at their master plan, especially if you're getting into real estate, because you'll get those questions a lot. What are they doing at that intersection of Washington and Bel Air Road? People are going to ask you those questions. It's really neat information to know. So master plans, and again, their planning objective is to control the growth rates and the pattern of growth in a certain area, and then also to plan for future development and to be ready for that growth. Because think about it, we had a new school built, an elementary school in our area recently. Part of that land planning and growth, when they tore down the old elementary school, they built a few more in its place, but in different locations. By the time some of those schools were built, our area had grown so much there's already portables. So how far in advance do you think that the local jurisdictions have to plan to be prepared for that growth that we in the real estate industry are bringing in? So it's definitely a very complicated process that most people kind of walk by every day and don't even realize it's going on, but it's really interesting once you get into it and start learning more. So that's land use planning and public land planning and control. Let's get into another one, zoning. Zoning is where the county or your local jurisdiction can dictate exactly what that property can be used for. You're going to learn about residential zoning, you're going to learn about industrial, commercial, agricultural zoning. In an easy breakdown, residential is where we live, commercial is where we work, commercial and professional. Agricultural is where we grow things. Industrial is where we make things. So a gas station on the corner would be commercial, but the bottling plant that creates the drinks for sale in the gas station would be industrial. Makes sense? But those are different types of zoning. And again, look at those. Why do you think it's important? Would I want somebody to have the ability to buy a piece of land right next door to my residence and put up a bottling plant? Maybe not. And guess what? The county might not either. And they can decide in advance which areas they're going to allow to be approved for certain types of zoning. So again, I think it's interesting, but I'm kind of a dork, so hopefully you enjoy learning about that as much as I do. We also go into subdivision regulations. If you ride down the road, no matter what type of area you live in, whether it's rural or urban, whether there's, big tall skyscrapers, definitely not in my town, or lots of farmland, everything originally started out with the land, and it's a process of how that's developed. We have a couple of neighborhoods that we're in the development of. I love to see a big, huge piece of land, the science behind making the roads work, dividing it out into houses, into lots, and those lots growing into actual properties that people move into. But subdivision regulation is another part of the government's control over how land is built and developed, and also building codes. You wouldn't want to buy a property if somebody wasn't looking over the shoulders of the builders and making sure that that process was followed along correctly. So most jurisdictions even have building inspectors that come in at certain increments in the property construction process to look over the construction standards, and there are building codes that determine how that property is built, and then once it's finished, you get a certificate of occupancy from the county, which means this house is safe for habitability. You can move in now. Next, private land use control. If public land use is what the government can do for private property, private land use control is what private individuals can do to control and dictate over the use of their personally owned properties. A couple of things that I want to make sure I'm pointing out to you that are really important that you'll see later. And again, some of these concepts you're just going to read on your own, you're going to know. But let's look at something. So what if I'm selling a property to you and I want to make sure that you don't ever put a bright purple storage building in the front yard? Maybe I've got the property beside you, and whenever I sell you the land I'm going to sell you, there are certain controls I want to keep over your property. If you're thinking about it, maybe you live in a neighborhood right now that has a homeowners association, but the first thing that popped into your head is, oh, it's a homeowner association rule. Just make a rule in the association that says that I can't build a purple storage building in the front yard. But remember, I also said that if I'm the owner and I'm selling you a property, I want to make sure you never do that. There's actually two different things that you could do. Yes, we could make sure it's in the homeowner association rules, but if I'm a private owner, I can actually permanently restrict the future use of my property by going all the way back to one of our previous lessons and having something written in our deed that whenever I sign that deed and transfer it to you, I can actually put limitations on your future use of that property that you can't undo unless I undo them. Only the original grantor can undo a deed restriction. So just like I said that with a condo, you don't look at just the way the thing looks, but know the concept itself, because It could look the same on the outside. No purple storage building could be homeowner association or neighborhood covenants, or it could be deed restriction, but the legality of those two things are completely different. The thing looks the same, but the details are 100% different. Homeowner association, if y'all get together enough of you decide you don't want purple storage builder, or you want to be able to build purple storage buildings in the front yard, you could change the rules. Deed restriction, it's going to be there unless the original grantor takes it out. So those are two concepts that people always get a little bit confused about when you read them, but remember, the details of the concept, good example, deed restrictions, they're actually written in the deed, put on by the original grantor, they carry on to the grantee and are permanent unless the grantor decides to go back and change them. Only the original grantor can change deed restrictions. So make sure you're paying attention to those as we're talking about private land use controls. And next we have environmental controls. Environmental controls. I mentioned the Environmental Protection Agency. You don't want your next door neighbor dumping, gasoline in your front yard because they're tired of using it. So there are certain rules that the government puts in place for the safety of everyone. And of course, local rules can also be even more stringent than some of the federal rules. And again, know what the rules are in your individual state as far as how those rules dictate private land use in your area. So with environmental controls, you have different things that would affect soil, water, even the air quality, different health standards, and even natural events and how those events, we talked about water rights earlier. If I'm doing something in the water in the stream behind my yard, it could affect other homeowners. So even environmental protection and different standards can dictate what I can do in even free-flowing water that would affect other people. So hopefully you enjoy getting into this as we look more at controls that outside influences can have on our privately owned property. Enjoy the session.